Today's modern working professionals expect a learning experience that reflects the world we live in. Canvas LMS is built to help organizations unlock the potential of skill-based learning by focusing on what matters to learners and their educators. From dynamic course delivery to adaptable credentialing, Canvas empowers learners to thrive in a rapidly evolving landscape. See what it's all about at canvas.com.
Welcome to The Accidental Trainer, a podcast where you'll hear firsthand stories and tips on how to start and grow your training career.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ATD Accidental Trainer podcast. I'm your host, Alexandria Clapp, and today we have with us Jared Cooney Horvath. Hi, Jared.
Hey, how you doing?
I am doing great. Jared is a neuroscientist, educator, and published author, and I'm so excited for him to be here as a fellow learning science enthusiast to teach us a little bit about learning transfer. So we're going to jump to that topic shortly, but first, of course, we have to hear about your origin story. So will you tell us a little bit about how you have landed in your current role and the work that you do today, and what was accidental in your journey?
Yes, no, I love it. So thank you for being here and letting me chat with everyone. I love this. So I was a teacher originally. So teaching was my passion. That's all I ever wanted to do. But I happened to be teaching during the decade of the brain. And so we just had all these brain books, brain gym, brain things people were talking about. None of it made any sense to me. So I figured, all right, I'll go back, learn that, and come back to my school and say, here's what this all means for us. And I genuinely thought that'd be like a year or two of my life. I've now been stuck in academia for 17 years. It's a black hole. You can't leave once you're in. But basically what I've studied in those years, I now study the science of learning as a whole. So any field that has to do with learning, neuro, psych, AI, behavioral economics, you name it. My job has been to synthesize all that. I bring that back to schools. So I primarily work with schools, teachers, and students. And I say, if this is how learning works, what does this mean for us for pedagogy? What does this mean for us when we're studying on our own? What is metacognition? So that's my life now is really fun. I get to kind of bridge the laboratory and the classroom and work in both spheres, which is really cool.
That's amazing. That's dedication. I'm not sure if I heard anything accidental, except for I guess that you thought maybe you were just going to quickly learn about the brain and then jump back into whatever you're doing.
I would say that is a huge accident. I had no clue my butt would be doing research. I had no interest in being a scientist. And lo and behold, my father was a doctor, and he always said, you know, don't work in sciences, don't work in a hospital. It's horrible. And so I swore I would never do it. Lo and behold, I'm in a hospital basically every day doing research. The one thing you swear you'll never do is the one thing you'll end up doing, guaranteed.
But it sounds like you get to do a little bit of teaching right now as well. So
yeah.
You're not just doing the research stuff. You still do.
No, and to be honest, the research, I don't love it. You do it because you have to. That's part of the job. But the teaching stuff is what I love.
Okay, so this is going to be a fun conversation for us to pick your brain, and you can do a little teaching about transfer. This conversation that comes up a lot, you're going to be able to help folks think about it in a different way, think about learning in a different way, knowledge in a different way. So I'm really excited to just start right at the beginning. Let's kind of define what we mean by learning transfer for this conversation.
So that's good. So transfer in this context is basically how do we move abilities, skills, knowledge, talents between different contexts. So yes, I was able to do it over here. How do I take that same skill and apply it over here to a new job, to a new school, to a new context over here? And I think it's good to kind of lay that out because some people, when we talk about transfer, I was asked to go give a talk on transfer at a university here a couple months ago. And so I did. I talked all about transfer. And at the end, they're like, we wanted to talk about students transferring between schools. I'm like, oh, I got no clue. I don't know how that works. It's fill out a paper. So no, we're talking specifically about skill transfer. The important thing to know about transfer, skill transfer is, and I'll put this right at the beginning, it will never happen automatically. It has never happened automatically. It can never happen automatically. It will never happen automatically. In fact, biologically, we are built not to transfer. So this means anyone who's ever transferred anything, it is a conscious process you have to walk yourself through. If you don't do it, so that means it doesn't matter how well you've taught something. It is up to the person doing the transferring to go through that transfer process. And if you don't go through that process, transfer doesn't happen.
Do we have a reason why that is? biologically, evolutionary, something?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's basically 3 steps to transfer, and it's the last step of transfer where biology kind of pushes back. But biologically, we are built to lock skills down and automate. I'm going to say something that's going to trip some people up. We can go on a whole conversation on this, but that's fine. You are not your biology. You are not a brain. You are not your brain any more than you're your heart, your lungs, your spleen, your knees, your toes. You are not in any of this. You are certainly of all of this, but there is a process called emergence by which we emerge from this interaction. We're not in it, we are of it, and we can feed back and start to change it. We are qualitatively different. That's why if you ever go to a university, brain and mind are always separated. They never bring the two together because we recognize there's a difference between the biology and the psychology. Biology wants the simplest road, which means anytime you learn something new, practice a skill, do anything, your biology is going to work to automate that and kick you out. It doesn't want to think. It doesn't want to work. It just wants to be basically input, response, input, response. You as a learner want to push beyond input, response. Ergo, you have to push back against a system that you are emerging from. So biologically, we are built to not transfer, but psychologically, my God, that's basically all we try to do. So there's always going to be this push between me and my brain, me and my body.
Love it. The mind and the brain. They've got their own agendas going on there. I want to break some of this down to ensure that transfer does happen. This is a question I see a lot. I get to moderate a lot of webinars, and I see some of the struggles that people describe in their organization and some of the disconnect that happens maybe in the training or maybe what a department or team is asking for. Can you create this for us? They're asking the learning department that, and they're seeing, but wait, if you're going to do a soft skills training, for example, on listening, what do you want like the end goal to be? So I think this will help for folks who are running into those kinds of problems. And I'm thinking about your article that is recently published in TD Magazine. You break down some steps. So maybe this is a place to go in the conversation. We sort of break down knowledge and contextualization and adaptation. Like, what are these things exactly from your perspective?
So this is perfect. So anyone who wants to transfer anything, there are 3 basic steps you've got to go through. Knowledge, context, adaptation. We're going to get a little bit more nuanced with those in a second, but I just want us to do a flyby of this first. So knowledge. Everything starts with facts. Here's one of the weirdest things we've learned about human beings. For a long time, we thought humans kind of worked like a calculator. And the way a calculator works is simple. You've got skills, abilities, talents on one side, and facts, knowledge, information on the other. Calculators work that so long as you've got a skill mapped to a button, then it doesn't matter what information you throw at it, you can use your skills. So like I've got addition mapped to a little button. Do anything you want. 3, 2, 1, plus 5, 4, 3, plus 6, 7, 8. Doesn't matter what you put in. So long as you got your skill, you can use your skill. For a long time, we thought that's how humans work too. If you got a skill, you can use a skill. But then we realized that ain't how it works with us. So I'm going to give you an example real fast. Let's take a skill. Let's take the skill of critical thinking. This is one of those soft skills, higher order thinking skills, whatever we want to call it. Now, I promise you everyone listening to this right now has the skill of critical thinking. You wouldn't have gotten this far in your career if you didn't. You've been doing it with me since you've been listening to this episode. You can critically think. Congratulations. You got the skill mapped. So all I'm going to do is tell you a quick story, and I want you to use your critical thinking skills here. So about 17 years ago now, in the Journal of Behavioral Brain and Medicine, an article was published that demonstrated when neutrinos in the left medial temporal lobe started to spin in a clockwise fashion, this generated a radio signal detectable by bold MRI recordings. Now, using your critical thinking skills, I want you to tell me what methodologically went wrong with that research, or if that is valid research, what does that suggest about how we've been analyzing MRI data for the last 3 decades? So I want you to go ahead, use your critical thinking skills, and tell me what's what.
And I'm like, I don't have enough prior knowledge to know any of the words.
That's it. My guess is you probably couldn't do it. And why? Is it because you don't have the skill of critical thinking? No, it's because you don't understand what the heck I'm talking about. In human beings, we do not have standalone skills that once we got it, we can use it everywhere. In human beings, we've found all of our skills are intimately tied to the information we have to use that skill with. If you do not understand the information, there is simply no skill there for you to use. And that's probably the most important thing I'll say on this whole thing. We do not have standalone skills. Our skills are tied to the information we need to use that skill with. If we don't have the information, there is no skill for us to use. So the first hurdle of transfer is knowledge. Facts precede skills. If you ever want to move your skills between contexts, You have to start with the knowledge, the facts relevant to that context if you ever want your skills to start to move over. So that's kind of our first. Now, like I said, too, we'll go back and get a little bit more nuanced on that, too. What do we mean by facts and learning? But I'll hand it over to you, Alex. Does that make sense? Like, what are you thinking?
Yes. I love that you're saying facts precede skills. One thing that drives me nuts is when folks sort of want to abandon the knowledge and say, we just want to focus on the actions and it doesn't matter about the knowledge. But you can't build the actions and the behaviors and build out that skill unless you have the knowledge. The underlayer. I've used this analogy in the past because I used to work with kids of like a Jenga tower, but your mountain of knowledge, like whatever visual works for people, it's the bottom layer that you need to have before
you don't have that. There's nothing on top of it.
So I just wanted to chime in to add, I agree. I concur. Okay. So our next layer, now that we've built in some knowledge.
So we've got our knowledge. Layer number 2 now is contextualization. So here's where we realize skills aren't things. Skills are basically just umbrella terms we use for a bunch of sub-skills, and those sub-skills are necessarily going to change dependent on context. Take the skill of collaboration. If you come to the operating room when we're doing brain surgery, collaboration is very specific. It looks like this. You do your job, I do my job. We trust each other's expertise completely. There is no discussion, there's no debate going on. It's a quiet place. But at any moment, if anyone in that room has a doubt or a fear or anything is happening, all they have to do is say stop. We hear the word stop, everyone literally stops, that person has the floor completely. That is collaboration in an operating room. You join me in my lab, oh, totally different. Now collaboration is me, I'm going to pit my expertise against yours. We're going to debate to see whose expertise can make better sense of the data we're talking about. Still collaborating, we're just doing something totally different. And go to Google or like one of those innovation hubs. I've never been there. There is no expertise. We're trying to build a collective expertise, so we throw a bunch of junk against a wall, see what sticks. In all 3 of these examples, we're collaborating. We're just doing something totally different. So hurdle number 2 says, now that I've got this knowledge, how does that knowledge redefine my skills? How do these facts change what I mean by effective communication? How do these facts redefine the idea of effective creativity? So you get the knowledge, you then have to use that knowledge to redefine, specify your skills. What are your skills going to look like? Critical thinking is not the same in every field. It's dependent upon the information. How does that change this? So that's hurdle 2. Any thoughts, questions on that one?
Yes. I love that you gave the examples of in different contexts, collaboration can mean something different. And I'm curious what your thoughts are for why this is such a big challenge for folks and organizations to figure out this contextualization piece. I was thinking about how even within your own team, like how you do your role, and then how you work with someone else in your team versus how you work with someone else in another team in your organization, or maybe how you work with like a senior leader. And we can continue to use the word collaboration, but fill in the gap with like whatever skill that you're trying to work on. It is like the problem child in your organization right now that you're trying to develop. That to me, I think could be the challenge, is that you need to have all these different iterations and like definitions of and the breakdown of like what exactly this looks like.
And that's what I think makes it so difficult. We'll get more specific with it shortly, but I think the difficulty comes in the fact that you're no longer looking at a unified thing. Is when it comes to knowledge, facts, we're looking at specifics. There is an answer. There's a right, there's a wrong. Once you get to the contextualization phase, you're basically saying, how do these facts arrange themselves to create a new definition? And there are a myriad ways you can organize and iterate facts. So this means at this level, you could have 6 different definitions of what effective communication looks like. And technically, they could all lay claim to being completely right. You've just got to select the best out of them. So because we've stepped out of the idea of there being 100% right, wrong, on, off, binary, black, white, we've now stepped into a realm of gray. That's where I think a lot of people get tripped up here, is where it's not as easy to track this as the first hurdle was. We're now moving into a whole new realm of thinking and learning.
I have another question here that I'm trying to think, work smarter, not harder. I don't know if this will apply, but do you think there's any type of hack for expediting this process when you have to go through defining all the specific actions and tasks and behaviors and how that makes sense. The differentiation between a role and a team and an organization. And
Absolutely.
Customers versus your internal stakeholders or whatever it is.
The hack is going to be simply to go through the process. Is most people try and shortcut the process, and in so doing, it takes them longer. But if you understand the steps you have to go through to get there, you always move faster than everyone else because you don't waste any time trying to jump immediately to something deep when you're like, no, I'm still here at the surface. Oh, let me apply some stuff. I'm not ready to apply. I'm still over here. So I would say the biggest hack is just simply understand the process well enough. Allow yourself to actually go through it. And the people who transfer the fastest, there are times when you think they're doing nothing and everyone else is running around and you're like, man, you're just sitting there. And then they snap and all of a sudden they're doing everything. And you're like, how the heck did you do that? I'm like, because I was learning. I was going through the process. It's not an immediate thing. It just takes a bit of conscious effort and time.
This makes me think also about, I was mentioning to you in my old organization, taught the science of learning. A lot of times we're working with students and we talked about transfer in the context of these quote unquote learning trials. One of them, for example, was like contextualization versus decontextualization, and how sometimes it's really valuable to be completely decontextualized away from whatever the actual real world environment is where you need to apply that skill. And the Olympics right now, like maybe there's surfing in like this very dangerous location. So maybe when they're doing like a warm up, they're like
doing it somewhere else,
or they're like in a VR headset and it's like not in the ocean and they're like doing a warm up in there. And maybe that's good when you're like developing a skill, right? Versus when you're like doing your race, you need to like be in the ocean. You can't just do the sand. There's so many of these like different trials, like antecedent supported versus consequence oriented, basically scheduling a feedback or scaffolding or all this different coined names, but basically mean the same thing. Does that all fall under this contextualization bucket?
Yes, to an extent, but mostly under the adaptation and the knowledge buttons, believe it or not. Now, that's interesting. No, yes, it will. It'll fall under all three. This is when we get a little bit more nuance with things, you'll start to see why if you train in one context but need to perform in another, you're going to do worse than somebody who has performed in another or trained in that other context and then has to perform there. Like literally, if I knew I had to learn how to surf for the Olympics on a big wave, I'm going to freaking surf big waves. That's the way to do it. Now, there are learning processes. So step one, you got to learn to get on a board. I don't even know how to do that. I haven't been in an ocean in 20 years.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can't jump immediately to that, but you start to get contextual issues, which are different than the concept of contextualization. Contextualization is specifically a matter of, as we're going to see, conceptualization of facts, whereas context plays into the facts themselves. I think we're hitting this thing where there's a word that's meaning two slightly different things that might be kind of gumming up the works a bit, but it will make sense soon, I promise.
Yeah, no. That definitely makes sense for me. I know that I've talked about those examples before on this podcast, and so I wanted to bring it up. I think I've even used that example just in case anyone holds on to those and remembers them.
The surfers?
Yeah.
No, it's good. What you'll see too is
about virtual reality. I think we talked about with dentistry. It's just one of those go-to examples that I go to because I also don't know how to surf. So if I was going to start, I would definitely want to not be in the ocean.
There's a process, and that's what's the trick is when you take an expert and you say, how are they training? That's how I need to train, is probably the worst way you can do anything. Expert learning and novice learning are basically mirror opposites of one another. If you say, hey, as an expert tying my shoe, what do? I grab the laces and I start talking to my wife. It's automatic. So does that mean when I teach my daughter to tie her shoes, I say, grab your laces, now start talking to your mom. It'll happen automatically. You got to earn the right to get up to that stage where now you can practice like an expert practices. In education especially, there's a movement to kind of bring expertise down to novices. And it's like, you can't jump into that. That is a phase of learning that you've got to earn. And if you don't go through the novice stuff, you won't get there. You can't fake that. You can't just jump into it.
Yes. Okay. So we got sort of on a little detour, but it was a good one. And we'll jump back to the next layer, which is adaptation.
So here's where biology is going to kick back, is the adaptation. So you've got all these facts, use all these facts to redefine your skills. Now you have to tweak your skill to match this new definition. And why does biology hate this? So anytime you learn something new, your brain moves through 4 basic processes that we're going to call basic biological learning. So let's say I take up golf, right? So I'm just swinging this golf club around. Now, when I start golf, I don't know what the heck is going on. My biology doesn't know what the heck is going on. Your brain will move into a mode called top down. This is basically when it goes active and it says, what are you doing? Like, is this like baseball? Is this like what's happening here? Now, through repetition, you start to develop some fluency. What's happening in your brain now is your brain starts to physically change. We call this plasticity. You've heard this term before. So your brain starts to say, my goodness, you're doing this a lot. Why don't I make that a little easier for you? Why don't I make that motion a little more efficient for you? Now you keep repeating. Eventually your brain is going to build what's called a module or a network. It's going to say, you are doing this so dang much. Why don't we just dedicate one part of the brain to this? We're going to have a one-to-one shot. Make this as effective, efficient as possible. Now you keep repeating. This is when your brain will now tail out on what's called bottom up. Basically, this is when your brain goes on autopilot. Your brain says, I've seen this a million times. I've done this a million times. I don't even need you here. As soon as you pick up the club, I'm going to do what I do. See you later. So through the process of repetition, your brain will move top-down plasticity, build a module bottom up. Now this, by the way, I should point out, when people say practice makes perfect, no, practice makes permanent. Your brain doesn't know the difference between good or bad. So any skill you practice, you repeat. If you're doing it badly, your brain will still go, cool, top down, build a module, bottom up. It'll still do the same exact thing. It's just now you'll have an autopilot horrible swing. Like if you're doing golf, you'll be on autopilot and you'll still stink. So it's not that practice makes perfect. It's that practice makes permanent. If you want perfection, you've got to practice perfectly. You've got to push that system through with perfection. So anyway, as you repeat anything, top down plasticity, build a module, bottom up. We're talking about transfer. We just said adaptation. We have the knowledge. We've used the knowledge to redefine our skills. Now we need to adapt our skill to match this new definition. Question, what do you think happens to your ability to adapt a skill as you move it through this process? As you take a skill top down, plasticity, build a module, bottom up in any one context, what happens to your ability to adapt, change, tweak that skill? Any guess? It gets harder and harder and harder.
In piece. This is like the language that some people use, right? You're making it more durable. Or am I thinking of the right terminology?
Well, you said an interesting term, generalization versus specialization. Here's where we see biology is a specializer. Biology does not do things generally. It wants to lock things down so that it can automate them. When I see X, I will always do Y. We want to be generalists. If you want to adapt a skill, now think of how hard this is. So let's say you've locked a skill down in one context. Now you want to change that skill. You're transferring it. You got to adapt the skill to do something different. You've now got to dredge that skill up out of your subconscious. This autopilot thing you've been doing for 10 years. You got to somehow pull that up, hold that in your conscious awareness while you work on it. And let's say you do it. Let's say you practice something new for 2 hours. You bring that skill up, you change it for 2 hours. As soon as you're done practicing this new variation, guess what your biology is going to do? Right back to normal. It's going to say, well, that was a fun 2 hours, but we've been doing this for 10 years. Sorry, we're going to go back to what we know. So you see, adaptability narrows with automaticity. In a very real sense, the better you get at any one skill in any one context, the harder it becomes to tweak that skill. Now, it's not impossible. We do it all the time. So this might be the second most important thing I say all day. So hear this one out. We believe skill adaptation moves faster than initial skill learning. So let's say it took you 2 years to learn how to do something in one context. Now, do you think it's going to take you 2 years to learn how to tweak that for a new context? No, it might only take you 2 months, or it might only take you 2 weeks. Adapting a skill is faster than initially learning a skill. The trick to recognize is that it's just not automatic. We have this mistaken assumption that says you just did it so well here that you should automatically be able to do it everywhere else. No, has never happened, will never happen. We also then start to blame ourselves. As trainers, as teachers, we think, dude, if I just teach you well enough, you'll figure this out. No, it has nothing to do with us. You could be the greatest teacher in the world. This transfer process is personal. They have to walk through the adaptation process. So this means the best thing you can do if you really want to see transfer start to happen, you really want to talk about a future-proof skill, it's this process, knowledge, context, adaptation. The people who understand that process, what it means, how do we go through each of those steps, are the people who transfer, learn faster than everyone else. It's the people who still think that transfer is magical, that if I just work hard enough over here, it'll happen, who always kind of struggle. So if you really wanted to teach somebody a 21st century skill, that's it, man. It's this process, not study skills. It's knowledge, context, adaptation. How does it work so you can start driving that yourself? So you recognize when it's happening so you can make the moves yourself.
You said practice makes permanent, and it made me think of this line from Charles Duhigg that your brain doesn't know the difference between good and bad habits. And that, I know James Clear's Atomic Habits is so popular now, but I mean, before there was James Clear, there was Duhigg's book. And that line has always stuck with me, just that like your mind and the psychology versus the biology and the brain piece sort of working against each other at times, that there's this very mindful, effortful component. And you mentioned earlier, I guess when you were talking about your origin story about metacognition, I think another challenge, even if we have the best L&D professionals creating really thoughtful learning experiences that are helping to encourage successful learning transfer, it might be for an individual in the organization who doesn't have any meta memory. Maybe they're relying on what feels intuitive, but we know that sometimes our intuition about learning is not reliable or helpful and actually like counterproductive. What do you think about that?
So I used to work at University in Melbourne, and I had, for about 6 years, I had freshman seminar. So I have 500 kids in front of me. And so we used to give them surveys. And so one of the questions we used to ask is, can you differentiate good study strategies from bad study strategies? And every year, about 90% of kids, they could tell you exactly what they needed to be doing. And then you track them throughout the year, and only about 30% of those kids would actually do it. So like everyone knew, 90% of kids knew what to do, but only 30% actually did it. And for a while, we couldn't quite bridge that gap. What the heck was going on here? So then we just peppered in some more questions. And we then asked, how do you do it? So instead of saying, is note summarization a good technique? You would ask the question, how do you summarize notes? All of a sudden, we went from 90% to 60% new. So we're starting to close this gap. Then we asked the question, why would this be a good technique? Why would summarizing your notes be so effective? That number now dropped from 60 to 30%. Only 30% of kids could tell you why. They understood enough about memory, learning, attention to say, because memory works like this, you need to summarize like this. Those 30% who could tell you why were the 30% who would actually do the stuff. So that was the big kind of trick we made, is if you want metacognition, if you want agency, it's not enough to know the strategies. It's not enough to know how to do the strategies. You need to know why the strategies work. Only when you understand why things function the way they do you see people actually taking on board and driving those systems themselves. So that was kind of our big secret to metacognition, was a lot of the time we focused on kind of the context and do you know the strategies? Have I asked you questions about the strategies? Can you do it? Yeah. And we just kept missing that big final piece, deep knowledge of the process that would make that strategy effective. If you're working with people that you worry this stuff isn't working, I'd say the first port of call is institute a class, 6-week class. How do you learn? Teach them the process of learning. And that's when you see the biggest take up and move from people that you otherwise wouldn't have expected to see it from.
I love that response. You packaged it so nicely. And when I think about who our audiences are for like the science of learning, there's 3 buckets to me. Senior leaders, because they are decision makers, purchasing power. They have the levers to create successful conditions in your organization. So you need them on board. You need them to understand. But also, obviously, all the people who are listening who may not be a senior leader. So if you identify as an instructional designer, a trainer, a training manager, whoever, because you're doing the work of creating these learning experiences, trainings, or opportunities. But lastly, and most importantly, is like the individual, each individual in the organization, regardless of like what your role is, even if you're not in L&D, whatever your role is. And I think that part, trying to create an opportunity for those folks and realizing like it's not even just about self-directed learning. It's about succeeding even in this current training that you're going to do and being able to do the transfer piece. So
I've been doing this for a long time. I've never had anyone learn about learning and go, yeah, that was unnecessary. Basically, everyone goes, why the heck don't I know this already? Like, because you start to realize maybe you come into it because you think it's going to make you a better employee or it's going to help you transfer to a new job. But you end up realizing this is humanity. Like, you learn about yourself. Is that why I act like that? Is that why my wife says this? Is that why my children do this? gives you an insight into you, which I think is wildly important. It's just getting people to realize that when they hear the term learning or metacognition, they're like, yeah, I'm not in school, I don't need it. If you just do it, everyone is grateful for it because it just gives you so much more agency over your own decisions and the way you live your life.
Okay, I still have so many questions, and I feel like we're going to run out of time, and we're going to
it happens.
More podcasts. Let me bounce back to some examples for knowledge where you're talking about knowledge building techniques. So there's ones that people might be familiar with, but I'm wondering if you have recommendations. For example, worked examples is in your magazine article, but I imagine there could be some nuance or strategy to how these are presented. You even gave the example before, an expert versus a novice learner. So there's probably something there, maybe in the worked examples, but are there tips?
Well, so I'm going to move, let's go back. So we've got our three hurdles. Here's going to be the big kind of secret for people. So when we talk about transfer, you've got knowledge, context, adaptation. Those are your three hurdles. Knowledge, context, adaptation, that is the learning process. Literally, transfer is learning. Learning is transfer. The two are synonymous. This is why I love, and Alexandria was talking about, there's been papers out there that are trying to define transfer and have taxonomies of transfer. And the joke is they rarely go places because they're talking about learning and they just don't realize it. They're trying to say, how do you learn to transfer? And you don't. Learning and transfer are the exact same thing. If you know one, you know the other. If you ever go into the transfer literature, it's just kind of funny sometimes because you see people fighting because they don't quite recognize you're just talking about learning, which means simplify the hell out of this. There's a much easier way to go about this. So when we talk about transfer, we tend to talk about knowledge, context, adaptation. Those are the hurdles. When we talk about learning, the terms you're going to hear are surface learning, deep learning, and transformative learning. But they're exactly the same thing. If you get one, you get the other. So since we now have kind of the overview of knowledge, context, adaptation, now we can kind of get more specific. So knowledge, surface learning. What is surface learning? Surface learning is predicated on the formation of facts, knowledge, information. So what is a fact? To understand this, I got to talk quickly about memory. So the way memory works is anytime you learn something new, your memory for that thing will become tied to the time and place where you learned it. It's highly contextualized. So we call these memories episodic memories. They are literally little episodes in your life. So imagine me going and seeing the Eiffel Tower for the first time. Now imagine I know nothing about it. Never heard that word before, don't know what it is. First time I see it, that's it. For the rest of my life, my memory will be tied to that afternoon I went and saw it. If there was people around me talking, whatever the weather was like, was I happy, was I sad? If I ever want to think about the Eiffel Tower, I'm going to have to mentally transport myself back to that moment and say, oh yeah, that thing I saw that one day. Cool. Now watch what happens. A couple days later, I'm in a cafe. Let's say I'm having a drink and what's that etched on my mug? It's the Eiffel Tower. It's that thing I saw a couple days ago. Oh, I love that thing. That's awesome. Now I have two episodic memories, day in the park, day in the cafe. A couple days later, I'm in a museum and wouldn't you know it, it's a painting of the Eiffel Tower thing. I just saw that a couple days ago. I love that. That's everywhere now. Now I have three episodic memories, day in the park, day in the cafe, day in the museum. What happens is the more episodic memories you make, your brain will start to compare and contrast them, and it will pull out any similarities. Anything that's the same amongst all your episodic memories, your brain will pull that out, create a brand new standalone memory in your brain called a semantic memory. Boom, that is a fact. That is what we mean by surface learning. Surface learning is predicated on the formation of semantic memories. Once you have a semantic memory, now you can start doing stuff with that information. So again, if surface learning is predicated on the formation of semantic memories are built on the back of episodic memories. This means at this stage of learning, you need multiple episodic memories if you ever want to pull out something usable that you can now start doing something with. So that leads to an important question. How many episodic memories do you need? And I wish there was one answer to that. There just ain't. It's sometimes one is enough. Like you grab a hot iron, you don't have to do that half a dozen times to figure out irons are hot. You do it once, you're good. You got a semantic, get out of here. But other things like periodic table, I've passed 5 tests on that in my life. Couldn't tell you anything about it today. Dozens of episodic memories, no semantic. There is no one hard answer, but we do know with a rule of thumb, about 70 to 75% chance a person has built a semantic memory based on whether or not they have 3 distinct episodic memories. 3 or more, you're about 70% of a chance they got it. 2 or fewer, 70% chance they don't. So at this stage of learning, this is the biggest hiccup we get. Most of us have one episodic memory. If you go to a conference and you learn something really cool and you're like, oh man, that was great information, I can't wait to use it. 1 week later, you're thinking, why was I so excited about this conference? It's because you've only got one episodic memory. And we can't do anything with an episodic memory. You cannot play with an episodic memory. You can only play with semantics. So already we're seeing we've got to hit the same ideas multiple times, depending on context as well, if we ever want people to start using it. And that's where a lot of us kind of get derailed. Most training is you've got about 2 days to learn everything. Best of luck. You're going to be stuck at the surface for a very long time if that's the way we're allowed to do it. So now you start to say what strategies work here, and you start to see the strategies are all going to be predicated on experience and thinking. In this case, recall. Let's just play with information. Let's see it again. Can you recall what we did yesterday? Can you point to something? Can you order something on a map? Can you tell me these things? Can you describe all this stuff to somebody else? We are just building multiple episodic memories with the same information in order to get to that next stage where now we can start to contextualize it. Now we can start to go deep with it. Does that kind of make sense? I know that was a lot, so I'll kind of pause there. Does that make sense? Or what are you thinking?
Yeah, no, definitely makes sense to me. That was a fun way to describe the relationship between episodic and semantic memories as well.
By the way, some research came out recently that I just think highlights this perfectly, is there are there are dozens of types of dementia you can get, but there's two kind of primary dementias you can get that are not Alzheimer's. One is called frontotemporal dementia. So that's where you basically lose the front part of your brain, the ability that allows you to think, the thing that we say kind of organizes our thinking. That goes away. Another form of dementia is semantic dementia. You lose your semantic memories. You keep your episodics, but the semantics go away. You give me those two groups. I give them a test of creativity. Which group do you think performs worse on creativity? So if we just assume baseline is normal, is it the people who can't think? Do they have less creativity? Or is it the people who have nothing to think about? Do they have less creativity? Who gets the bigger hit, frontotemporal or semantic? And a lot of people assume it's going to be frontotemporal. It's going to be the people who can't think. Frontotemporal dementia loses about 40% from baseline. Semantic loses about 80% from baseline. The people who can think just fine, but they've lost their semantic memories, they only have episodic memories, lose creativity. They lose a lot of their skills. Why?
You didn't let me guess.
Oh, sorry about that. Oh, sorry. Go for it. Go. Why do you think that would happen? Why would I lose creativity with episodic memories?
Well, I think it goes back to that conversation we were having about you need the knowledge and facts to apply to a skill. And in this case, the skill, fill in the gap, is creativity. So you can be creative if you don't have any knowledge to pull from.
And so what is the definition of knowledge then? It's the semantic fact rather than the episodic. We tend to assume that as long as you've got experience with something, that counts. You give someone with semantic dementia a creativity test, give them a brick and say, how many ways can you use a brick? They will tell you their episodic memories. Well, I once used a brick to build a wall, and I once used a brick as a doorstop. Cool. How else could you use it? I've never used it in any other way. No, I know you haven't, but think outside of how else might you be able to use it? You can build a wall, you can use it as a doorstop. They cannot leave their episodic memories. They have no usable knowledge, which is the semantic fact. So that's where you get stuck on that skill. So that's why I think it's important to recognize this first hurdle. When we talk about facts, it's not enough to just see it. You've got to build a semantic. That's when we can do stuff with it. Which, by the way, that goes back to your discussion on context, what we were talking about. So the content of a semantic memory will be determined by the context of the episodic memories. Like you were saying, let's say I am learning surfing, and today I do it a surfboard in the ocean. Tomorrow I do it on a boogie board in a pool. Next day I do it on a different board in a wave pool. The only thing similar in all of these three things is going to be me getting on a board. So your semantic memory is going to say, I guess you can get onto a board. But let's imagine I say, I get on a board in a pool today. Same board, pool tomorrow. Same board, pool the next day. Now your semantic is going to say, I guess you can only get on a board in that pool. And now your semantic becomes a little bit more specific. So we see this is where context really starts to matter. Do you have a very specific reason for something? In which case, build context in. Like if I need you to answer this same phone every day, great, we're training on that same damn phone every day. I don't need you to answer 50 phones, just that one. But if you want to build a skill that's more freely movable, then you got to change context. You got to practice outside, inside, upstairs, downstairs, when it's raining, when it's hot, when you're hungry, cold. Take it as many different contexts as you can. Now you can start to pull that skill out, and now you have a more freely movable skill. So that's why if you go back to experts, when you look at F1 drivers who are training in VR, they can do that because they've basically driven everywhere. Their semantics are so malleable at this point that training in VR is going to be the same as training on a road. Give me a novice, and all I ever do is train them on VR. Now I say, get in an F1 car and go drive Monaco. They ain't going to be able to do it. They're going to suck because, unfortunately, they lock their skill down in one context, which is only VR. And because they've had no other context to play that in, their body's going to lock that down, and they have a less movable skill, a less transferable bit of knowledge there. Again, it's not impossible. We can get there, but it's just we start to see where these kind of things hiccup on each other.
It makes me think of that variability study with the kindergartners to do the beanbag toss, and they have practice with the same partner and the same beanbag in the same place. And then they have the other groups that change the size of that they're tossing and the distance and their partners and the location. And then they're like, who does better? And it's the people who've practiced in all these different environments or situations or contexts.
And what sucks, I think this is when you were talking about intuition of learning, is when you practice in one context one way, and again, sometimes that might be exactly what you need, you will do better during practice. So your assumption is, I'm learning more, I'm going to do better in performance. Whereas if you're constantly changing context, during practice, you look worse. But come performance time, you look better. So you don't see the fruits of that labor until later, until it's performance time. And I think that's where a lot of people start to avoid that. Like if you go golfing, right? My brother does the same progression every day. I'm going to do 100 driver, I'm going to do 100 9 iron, I'm going to do 100 this, cool. And he looks great. But no one's ever golfed 18 holes where there's 100 drivers in a row and then 100 9 irons in a row. When you golf, it's all over the shop. So you'd be better off at the driving range chopping and changing. Do 2 with this club, go to this club, over here, go putt, go back to this club. But when you're doing that, you never get into a groove. So it always looks worse than the guy who's just driver. So during practice, it looks worse, but during performance, it comes to bear then.
This reminds me, this is a great tangent, but it reminds me of a video that I saw on Instagram of a professional golfer who was breaking down her swing. And she was only doing one section of it because she was changing something. And she's a professional, and someone who was nearby was trying to offer her some advice, not realizing
that she's doing something specific.
Yeah, and so it doesn't look right because she's actually breaking it down discreetly into this one specific section. So, of course, it's just so fun to nerd out about this. Hopefully, all of these are good examples for folks as they're thinking about how they might apply this back in the job.
Back in the real world.
The real world. Okay, I still have so many questions for you, but let's try to get to a few more before we wrap up. I wanted to talk a little bit about, and this was for our ATD community. We did a capabilities model, pulse survey in the beginning of the year. And one question that comes up a lot is just understanding if there's new research coming out with the lens of being online or being digital. So yes, there's side of learning research, but is anything different in the context of now you're doing it through Zoom? So we're talking about transfer. Does it happen differently when you work online?
Good rule of thumb. I'm going to say something that's going to scare some people, but bear with me. It'll make sense in a second. Every human being, this is what I love about learning. It is the exact same for everyone. Every human being, once you reach about the age of 5 and beyond, we all learn in exactly the same way. Now, a lot of people get really miffed at that, but don't. You don't have to, because watch this. All human beings digest in exactly the same way. Of course we do. No one's got a problem with that. It's self-evident. No one's got 3 stomachs and they chew cud, or no one spits acid and absorbs nutrients to their skin. If you're a human being, there's a certain system you have to use. Now, we have different inputs. The things I can put through that system might change. Some people can't do dairy, some can't do gluten, but that doesn't change the process itself. How does the body extract nutrients? How does it extract waste? Same thing now, that goes into systems. If you are missing your stomach because of cancer, or you've lost your esophagus due to cancer, it doesn't change the system. Your system, we have to bypass it. You have to put a tube in or take things out differently. But the body still extracts nutrients and excretes waste in exactly the same way. That's what makes us human. If you had a different system, you just wouldn't be human. You'd still be biology, but you wouldn't be us. Learning is exactly the same because it's a biological mechanism. Everyone's brain works exactly the same. No one has a special system. Again, the inputs might change. What I need to push you through. If you're blind, I can't show you a picture. If you have ADHD, you might need higher valence stimuli than somebody else, but the input is different than the process. Once the process is going, it's exactly the same for everyone. So this means learning, science of learning, is the science of digital learning. There is no difference in person and online. There is no difference on a book or a heart. The process by which we learn is going to be the same. Now we can make the shift, though, to questioning efficacy. So everyone digests the same way. If you eat protein versus someone who eats sugar every day, we can say, what's the efficacy of sugar versus protein going through that system? So now we can say, what's the efficacy of learning online versus offline? And surprise, surprise, we have 4.5 decades of data showing digital tools harm learning. The best you could ever say about digital tools is that they are equivalent to in-person or hard copy learning. At no point over the last 45 years do we have evidence suggesting that it is better. And a lot of the evidence suggests it is far worse. So I always tend to say, man, if you can print it out, print it out. If you can do it live, do it live. If you have manipulatives versus digital, do that. You will always learn more with something tangible and with another person than you will online. That's just, sorry, you can be as mad as you want. That's 45 years worth of data I can just shove at you. It doesn't change that. So what might change then if we're thinking about transfer is, one, you're already going to have an issue that learning goes down when we're online, so transfer will also go down. But then you have a context issue as well. If we do, and we saw this during COVID, we did most of our learning online. Kids come back to the classroom and all of a sudden they can't do anything. And a lot of teachers thought, well, that's it. They just didn't learn well. No, they learned decently. It's just the transfer issue. They had locked their skills down to a screen, to a little keyboard. And now that they came into the real world and we said, now use your skills here with a pen and paper and kids around you, they just couldn't do it. So we had to spend a good 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks just transferring, bringing those ideas back online in this new context. So you see the biggest issue when it comes to transfer in tech is the context issue. If you learn online, but you have to perform in real life, you will always get a hit there. But if you learn online and you perform online, then it should be totally fine. If your job is on a computer, then by all means learn on a computer. But if your job isn't on a computer, then you're going to have that contextual hit you got to worry about.
It's making me think of folks who have frontline workers and they're incorporating some type of digital learning component into their training programs for their workers. That's nice, but there should definitely also be the what's out in the field component.
It has to be. It's interesting too. We were just talking about this the other day. Learning is highly interpersonal. So if you look at the impact of different things on that learning process, again, the process stays the same. We're not talking about learning changing. We're talking about what impact do different things have on that process. A lot of people think there was this whole argument of, it was called the 2 sigma problem, where people said, if you get one-on-one tutoring, that is the gold standard. Everything past that, we're just trying to reach one-on-one tutoring. That's when you're going to learn the best. Turns out that's nonsense. The 2 sigma problem was a statistical aberration. It was only found back in the 80s, and it was Benjamin Bloom, Bloom's taxonomy dude, Mr. Bloom himself. So his whole 2 sigma thing was based on his PhD students had this research, never published it. He just looked at it, said it. Since then, we've gotten a lot more data. The impact of one-on-one tutoring is closer to about 0.26 sigma. It's not 2. It's almost an order of magnitude less. Now, why would that matter? I mean, it's still powerful. 0.26 is still good. If you look at the impact of relationship between teacher and student, that has an impact of 0.67. So if you want to talk about what's more important, an empathetic relationship with the person I'm learning from, or being taught specifically how I want to be taught with feedback at the right moment, the right pedagogy, you always got to go with the relationship. Almost 2.5 times more power comes from simply caring about the person you're learning with or from. And so you could assume most tech, most AI, all these products, they're probably really solid on pedagogy. That's what a computer is good at. It knows how to give you feedback and stuff, but that stuff seems to be less important than who you're learning from. So if we're talking about having real world applications, the more you can bring yourself as the designer, as the teacher into that real world as well, people will learn better, faster, easier. If they care about you and you care about them, learning just starts to jump. That's one of the coolest things I think we found in the last kind of 20 years is we always talk about relationships as like the soft side of education. We're like, no, that's probably the first port of call for all of this. And that's maybe the first thing a lot of us skip because we're more interested in getting right to the juice of stuff.
This is fun because I just saw an article recently. I can't remember where or if I even read it, if I just saw the headline, saved it. But I'm always fascinated by social learning, especially because people are so much of the time spending time online. And so then what does that look like combining tech with the science of learning principles? But it was about who you're learning with. And when you like the people that you're learning with, that can have an impact on how you succeed. So peer and student relationship, but who are your peers? Which then I'll have to find this article. I don't know where it is, and I'm upset because I'm pretty sure I didn't read it. I just saved it like, oh, I can't wait to read that. But it makes me have all sorts of questions like, what's in your locus of control? Because, I mean, it just goes to show, you're going to have to establish psychological safety really quick when it's a bunch of strangers and you don't know them, so that you can feel comfortable and safe and like them to learn better. But what happens when you're enemy or you're someone you have a strained relationship with and you haven't quite figured out how to resolve that yet?
And this is where metacognition comes in, is the more you know the system, the more you can recognize when the system is going to be tricky and you need to go run it yourself. People also always talk about autodidact, these human beings who teach themselves. The trick is, no, they're not teaching themselves. They're learning through other people, just not live people. So like when I say somebody taught himself math, I don't mean Einstein literally invented calculus from scratch. What we mean is he didn't have a live teacher. He learned from Newton's writings. We still have teachers. We just start to select our own. When we talk about autodidactism, what we really mean is someone has metacognition enough to know, like you were saying, I have the wrong peers around me. I have the wrong teacher in front of me. I need to go learn this from somebody that I genuinely care about. And sometimes that person is dead, but I'm still learning from their books, their writing. I'm not inventing it from scratch. I'm teaching myself by actually learning from somebody else who just doesn't happen to be live and in person. And I think the more you have metacognition, the more you can recognize when are the moments I need to step away, find people I genuinely care about. Maybe that's someone online, maybe that's a YouTube, maybe that's an author, and learn from them. We call that self-learning, but realistically, you're just learning from a different teacher. That teacher just happened to write things instead of say things. And you can still connect with writing as well. Dead authors, we can connect with them too.
I'm going to loop back to when you were talking about digital learning and some of the research there, because you talked about the empathetic relationships. And I'm thinking of your Harvard Business Review article. I know we're running out of time, but I just wanted to touch on it briefly, touching on AI. So what do we know so far about AI's role in learning and its impact, whether it's on learning or transfer or all in this realm?
AI, like every other tech we've ever had, harms learning. It's not good because most people are using it and people say, oh, it's not the tool itself. I guess, whatever. Look, if everyone uses the tool badly, you can blame the tool. It's okay to say that. And so that's what I think most people say. People are using it wrong. If 90% of people are using a tool in one specific way, you can't say they're using it wrong. You can say you thought they should use it differently, but you can't say they're using it wrong. You could say they're not using it the way you intended, but you can't say they're using it wrong. If that's the way the world is using it, they're using it right. That's the way this kind of breaks down. But so the way most people are using AI is they're trying to circumvent the knowledge hurdle. I have access to information. Why should I learn it? Let's use AI to tell me what's what. Then I can immediately jump into contextualization, start bringing my skills to bear on it. And that will just never work. All skills require information to be internalized in your long-term memory if you want to be able to bring your skills to bear on it. So step one, using AI as kind of a shortcut to that first hurdle has been harming learning. And that's what we see when kids use it for essays, when people use it to look up stuff to avoid having to write papers. You're basically just killing your own learning process. Beyond that, when people use it as tutors, again, because you can't form an empathetic relationship with an artificial intelligence or a piece of technology, and I could explain the mechanisms another time, you simply can't. You will never learn as much from AI as you will from another person. And so what you tend to see is people will only push up to a level of discomfort and then they will quit. So let's say I'm learning from AI and I push up to my level of discomfort. I have no one to fight for. I have no one to fight with. That's usually when they tap out and they say, I'm out of here. I get to that same level of discomfort with a human teacher who I actually like. Now we're going to work together to fight past that, to push over that, and then the learning keeps going forward. The mechanism by which empathy and an empathetic relationship boosts learning seems to be once you get to the struggle spot, if you have an empathetic relationship, you work together to push forward. If you don't have an empathetic relationship, you bow out, you quit. And that's what most people seem to be doing with AI. And by the way, we've known this forever. This is why Khan Academy didn't change the world. Is people, once they're good, once they're feeling good, as soon as they get to the first period of struggle, they will bow out, which is, I think, something like 85% of people never finish online programs for that exact reason. They have no empathetic connection to do anything. So AI seems to be harming us from the empathy angle, from the pure learning standpoint angle, and last but not least, from the multitasking angle. The single worst thing you can do for learning and memory is multitasking. AI is run on computers. What is the one thing every human being does on a computer? They multitask. That's it. So if you could somehow run AI off of a computer, you might be able to learn a little bit more from it. It still wouldn't be equivalent, but you could do a little bit better. But so long as AI is on a computer and computers are used to multitask, it will always harm learning. AI is just the next iteration of Wikipedia, as far as I'm concerned. Like, it's cute, it's funny, but man, it hasn't changed anything in education that I've seen. I saw a lot of hype, but I see a lot of that pendulum is now swinging right back. And a lot of people are like, wait a second, you're just copying and pasting the same you did from Wikipedia. Yep. You're learning just as less as you were from Wikipedia. Yep. You're circumventing your learning the same way. Yep. It's just a brand new encyclopedia. To be fair, man, we all did it. I'm not calling anyone out. I did it. We didn't have Wikipedia. We had Encyclopedia Britannica. I copied that right down. It's what we do, but I don't think there's anything magical with this new tool that's somehow changing the world.
Well, what I'll say to that is that sometimes you don't need to learn something. And in fact, it's probably more efficient to not have a training. It's just a performance support. I need to have information right now to do this task. And it's not even going to be relevant ever again in my role, but it's very urgent right now. And it might take me 2 weeks just to find the right person in my organization to help me how to do it. But because I have this AI tool, maybe I can do it right now all by myself, get it done, never think about it again. So there's some instances where it's going to make a lot of sense.
But you see, that has nothing to do with learning. Yeah. So we've now shifted gears from AI as a learning tool to AI as a support tool. Sweet. I have no clue about AI as a support tool. I'm talking purely about learning. Yeah. It is not a good learning tool at all.
Yeah, that's just my 2 cents in terms of, I think that figuring that piece out in your organization is probably.
I would say, and this is just thinking off the back of that. Let's say you do use AI to do something that you don't want to learn. You're now still stuck with the vetting question. So you go on AI, you say, hey, do this thing, and it pops out an answer. Like, do some stats for me, right? I don't know how to run an interclass correlation. Do that for me, AI. And it pops out an answer. Looks good. You use it. You go about your business. You have no clue how accurate that thing is. Now you bring in a statistician who looks at your output and says, that's not right. That's not the right equation to use. So even when you're using it not for learning, when you're just using it for kind of offloading, I still think you're always going to come up against that vetting issue where how far are you willing to trust it? It's the same with Wikipedia. If I read something on Wikipedia, I can only really engage with it up to my knowledge level. Anything past that, I have to take Wikipedia on faith. And I do. Most of the time, I take it on faith. I'm like, cool, yeah, you must have born that day. You must have been dead that day. But we recognize that there's always that percentage of possibility where, no, somebody futzed around there or it didn't give you the right thing. I guess you're going to always have that risk-reward ratio where you've got to say, how far am I willing to take this before I get somebody with expertise to come and tell me, is this right or wrong? And sometimes you're fine with it. Sometimes you might need to bring a real person in to say, that was a little wrong. No, those stats are a little off.
It goes back to the metacognition thing of having the awareness to decide how much risk reward, being able to make that analysis. I mean, when Wikipedia first came out, you probably defaulted to, I don't trust this answer. This seems like made up. So maybe that for the folks who are more cautious, they're waiting for the vetting process to sort of be built in, or the organization to create the in-house reliable AI tool that is maybe built on a single source of truth, institutional knowledge that is actually reliable in some way. Well, I know we could keep talking about all sorts of things forever and ever. We are absolutely running over time.
You're way out of time.
Such a pleasure to pick your brain, ask you questions. I want to turn back to you and talk about what you're up to. How are you learning right now?
Oh, cool. I'm reading a bucket load. So I'm working on a documentary right now on genius. So for about the last 10 years, I've been really trying to lock down where does genius come from? Is it born? Is it made? And it took a long time, but I finally kind of got, if you could see the stack of stuff I've had to go through, it's nonsense. But I finally got the kind of pattern, the story down. So now we're working on turning that into a documentary. So hopefully get that into more people's mindset, is because I think a lot of people think, and you probably know the secret, a lot of people, when it comes to learning, they have self-limitations put on because they think, well, look, I'm not a math person. I wasn't born to be like that. Look at that swimmer. I'll never swim like that. We just assume some people are born kind of different than others. And man, that just ain't how any of this stuff works. That's not how genes work. That's not how the brain works. So I'm hoping this documentary kind of breaks down that story, helps people re-engage with learning to go, okay, wait a second. How does learning actually work? And can I push this system further than I thought? And the answer is yes, you can. You just got to know that it's possible. You got to start playing the game right. Hopefully, I want everyone to kind of engage with it, but I work in schools, so my big kind of push is hopefully for the next generation is I think we've seen this, especially with digital tech, we're going to see a real dip in creative, innovative output from an entire generation of people just because they haven't gone through the learning process. They think creativity is something you have or you don't, and it's something you should be doing from day one. It's why waste time going to college when I could just go start a business. All these things are fine. But my goodness, if you look at what it takes to reach the highest echelons, to actually change a field, there's a long process that most people are simply skipping. And so I'm hoping to inspire the next generation to get back to work. Don't short circuit this process. It's a shitty process. It's a long process. No genius has ever been a genius in a day. It takes decades to get there, but you will never get there if you don't do those decades. And so if you want to genuinely make a difference, there is a path to take. And I hope to inspire more people to take that path again. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to go to college. I just said that as an example. You can do just fine without going to college, but there's still a path you have to walk.
One last question before we let you go. How can folks keep up with you and your activity?
If you want to know more about learning, so I've got a YouTube page. It's just Jared Cooney Horvath. From Theory to Practice is like the official name, I think. But every couple weeks, I translate a new piece of learning research for practice. We say, if this is what the research says, what does that mean for us as teachers? What does that mean for us as designers, as curriculum designers? Those are some free sources there. If you go, my website is lmeglobal.net. So Learning Made Easy, global. And so there, every article I've written, there's more there. There's courses if you want to really dive deep into the science of learning. We've got full courses for teachers, for students. Just a lot of stuff there. So really YouTube and LME Global. Those seem to be the two places where I do most of my work.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jared. This was such a blast to chat with you today.
No, thank you. I loved it. This was awesome. And sorry for taking it so dang long.
No, not at all. I hope our audience loved it. Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you to our sponsor, Canvas by Instructure.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from the Association for Talent Development. Be sure to check the show notes for resources mentioned in today's episode. And if you found the show useful or insightful, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with a colleague.